Hello and welcome to tonight's event, an author talk with Alexis Coe about her book, You Never Forget Your First, a biography of George Washington. Before we get started with tonight's event, a quick reminder, there will be plenty of time for audience questions during tonight's program. If you have questions for Alexis, please feel free to put them in the chat box or the Q&A box at any time during tonight's event, and I'll work them in as we go. So no need to hold your questions for the end. Now I'd like to introduce tonight's author. Alexis Coe is an award-winning author of Alice and Frida Forever, A Murder in Memphis, soon to be a major motion picture, which I'm really looking forward to. And she's also the author of You Never Forget Your First, a biography of George Washington. Coe has frequently appeared on CNN and the History Channel and has contributed to the New York Times, the New Yorker, and many other publications. She's a host of Audible's Presidents Are People Too and No Man's Land. Coe holds a graduate degree in American history and was a research curator at the New York Public Library. She lives in upstate New York with her family. Please join me in welcoming Alexis Coe.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Hi, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for being here with us tonight. How have you been holding up this late summer season?
Quite well. It is lovely up here, despite the sirens that might have just gone by in my small village. It's been a lovely end. I always like the fall though, because that's when I feel like one really gets to work, which is very Ben Franklin of me, and I stand by it.
Well, let's jump right in with about your book, which I have here. So everyone out there, I put a link in the chat box to Alexis's website where you can find further links to purchase the book, or the library does own a few copies, so make sure to check it out. But I wanted to touch base about how many biographies of Washington I have on my bookshelf at Duncan. There's so many. And when you published this one, you became the first woman historian to write a biography of Washington in over a century. Why was it important to you that a woman write a biography of Washington? And do you think there's still room for Washington biographies on that crowded bookshelf?
Oh, yes. I think we've really just begun. But I didn't really feel like gender played a role in it at first because I hadn't had this realization. When I first pitched the book, I did feel compelled to, because I felt like there were some really strange takes. And when I looked up some of it in the archives, it wasn't really consistent with what I was finding. But it actually wasn't until I was a couple of years into writing the book, I rearranged my books on my desk because I moved my desk, and it's like, I will forever do this now every 4 or 5 months, because that's when I realized I looked at all the names and I thought, white man, white man, white man, white man. And it just kept going. And then I had to confirm with Mount Vernon and the University of Virginia, Washington papers before I believed it myself. I thought I had to be wrong.
There you go. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about some of the stories that you came across. So in the book's introduction, you write that there are a number of myths surrounding Washington's life. We all know some of the common ones. He chopped down a cherry tree and he cannot tell a lie, for instance. However, you go further, stating that some of the stories told in other Washington biographies border on creative writing. What are some myths about our first president that surprised you and stood out to you while you were researching? And have any other Washington biographers reached out to you regarding your view of their creative writing?
No, I haven't heard from Ron Chernow. I wrote him an email when it was clear that everyone was starting to focus on that. When the book came out, I was really fortunate, got a lot of attention, but almost all of them led with as if I had challenged Ron Chernow to a duel. And I just wrote him and said, you're one name in this chapter. And I also say I really like your writing, which is true, I really do. But it's sometimes so good, it's literally wrong. And one of the things he does is he really went to town on Mary Washington's mom. And I find this happens actually a lot in history. I'll just read a claim, you know, be reading along, it'll all be really standard, and then something will jump out at you as like totally ridiculous. And the way that he described her, he used words I would never use professionally: crusty. He used sort of every sexist word in the book. It just seems so vitriolic. And so then I just started fact checking his claims. And one of the things that he talks about is like, Mary Washington burst into Mount Vernon and confronted Washington and stood in his way and blah, blah, blah. And the letter that he cites, all Washington says is, my mother came to visit with other family members. I'm going to be late arriving because of that and a bunch of other things that like I sort of procrastinated on. It's like, how do you get there? And so then that was actually what made me feel compelled, that and some other things. That the biggest one, however, to just talk for a very long time without letting you ask a follow-up, but the biggest one on the other side is the way Mount Vernon and the way a lot of biographers tell it. Washington emancipated his slaves in his will, and they were free the day he died, and that's simply untrue. One man walked free, William Lee, who had served quite famously Washington during the Revolution and had been crippled in his service. He walked free, and the rest, it very clearly said, and they eventually knew, even though most of them couldn't read because reading was a danger to people who were enslaved. The will was published because Washington wanted everyone to know this, and other things about him, like he had a lot of land, it turned out. And he published it, so they eventually found out that the only thing standing between them, so hundreds of people, the only thing standing between them and their freedom was Martha Washington's life. If she died, they would be free. So it got back to her clearly that they were aware of this. She became really paranoid, and she gave them their freedom a year later for her own peace of mind. And she, of course, still had hundreds of enslaved people, many of them who were married to Washington's slaves. And after she died, none of them, saw each other again.
I do want to touch more on slavery a little later in the conversation, but we do have our first audience question. So just a quick reminder to the audience, you can ask questions and I'll pepper in the questions as they become relevant to what we're talking about. So there's no reason to hold your questions till the end of tonight's talk. Our first question comes from Erin, and she's interested in hearing more about challenging other historians. So Erin writes, what do you think the public reaction that you might have challenged other historians says about the public view of historic scholarship? Do you think there's an understanding of how scholarship evolves and is recontextualized, especially when it concerns the most defined figures like Washington?
That is a good question. Well phrased, straight to the heart of the matter, which is that I did nothing that hasn't been, should be done more often, but is rarely done in founding history, and almost never by a woman, and not with any humor. And I treat history like anything I love. I'm quite serious about it, but I can also have fun with it. And levity is not illegal, certainly, and not when we're trying to get people interested in history, as long as you hew as closely as possible to the primary sources. And so it was sort of surprising to me that so much was made of it. And I got the optics of it, a young woman historian punching, up at Ron Chernow, most famous historian. It just was a little bit strange that people didn't pay attention to the actual things I was calling out, besides the easy stuff. Like I have a chart of the words that he uses, but no one really talked about, the points I made about the documents he really wrote a novel about, and such. And so that was a little bit disappointing. It showed that it sort of skimmed the surface. And then it was really frustrating to hear from so many people who are very emotionally attached to founding history, and it can only be celebratory.
Thank you. So let me pull up my list of questions. There we go. So I want to talk a little bit about, so in the book, you do talk about, I love that you call them thigh-men. I really loved your humor in this book. What is a thigh-man for our audience who may not have read your book yet?
Yeah, so I must first say with this caveat that it was never supposed to be in there. When one is in graduate school and they like imagine, oh, will I ever like contribute a term or a word or a phrase or like a school of study? No, never. I couldn't imagine. I did not think thigh-men would be my claim to fame, but it was my shorthand, and I had it in brackets when I gave it to my editor and my husband, who's an editor, and second readers, an editor at the Washington papers, who was a fact checker on it and became a good friend. And the reason I was using it as shorthand was I couldn't quite think of a phrase for the way that Washington biographers talked about him in language that you would typically find in a romance novel. They were just so enamored with his body, not for like the great things about it, the diseases it survived and how that informed him and strengthened his resolve at inoculation during the first year of the revolution. It was huge for us. They focused on like the way the muscles in his jaw rippled and the way he gripped the flanks of a horse. Like, I'm quoting them, and it was so odd to me, but the unifying thing that they all liked, and Chernow, of course, he was sort of always the most extreme with all of this. He talked about like the size of his hands, and like that's how we know he was definitely, he could definitely have children. It was Martha's fault, even though she had children. There was no evidence that but never mind. And so I thought, I thought that was really, I was trying to come up with a word and I couldn't, so I just said thigh-man, and I'll come up with something later, like great, something as dignified as great man history. And that did not happen because they all took it out of brackets and said it's hilarious across the board. Everyone, whether they were sitting at like a presidential papers, the office of the presidential papers, or in an office in Penguin Random House, they all liked it. So I gave in to the crowd, but I probably use it the least of anyone.
Well, I thought it was just a hilarious way to bring levity to such a serious topic. And you talk about it in the context of other biographers spend a lot of time on George Washington's very many military accomplishments. But when you write about Washington during the Revolution, you focus more on his role as spy master. And I'm not sure most modern Americans would associate Washington with spies. How important were spies to winning the Revolution, and what was Washington's role in the greater American spy network?
I was really interested, the question one always has about the revolution is how? Even when you study it, how did we win? It seemed implausible. They were the British. They were an empire, long established, with money, and we didn't even have votes. And so it was sort of overwhelming. And one of the things I really tried to focus on was less of the battles, particularly the ones that he wasn't present for, which is what so many of them spend pages and pages on, Lexington and Concord and other things where he hadn't even joined yet. It happened a year before. So I instead decided I would look at his other virtues. And one of them was spy master. Another was the court of public opinion. He was very good at making America seem like a more like a humanitarian nation, even in comparison, which is hilarious, considering that, of course, all these men enslaved people compared to the British, because a lot of things. But one of the things I talked about is spy master, because he sort of famously he could hold his tongue. It took him a while, not when he was young. He used to have these like blow ups, but as he got older, he really learned to control himself. And a part of it was that he was really uncomfortable with his dentures. By the time he was inaugurated, he had one tooth left, and his dentures were made of, walrus, different kinds of ivory, nothing good. And then, of course, the teeth of enslaved people. And he was self-conscious of it. He also was self-conscious as he progressed with being around people who had gone to college, Harvard, William and Mary, all of these places. And he had to drop out because his mother couldn't afford it. She was a widow, of course. And so people talk about that, but they really don't talk about how that worked in his favor so often. He made people uncomfortable. He made people very uncomfortable because he could control himself. and he didn't talk a lot. And so they felt the need to fill the space. And so that was definitely beneficial to him in politics. And as a spy master, he could really understand the language. He enjoyed it. And one of the ways that we supplemented our many deficiencies as, a nation, as a young, nation who they were still calling just rebels. But as this country, this infant nation, was to try and be creative. And so he would get really performative too. He would write to people and he would say, like, look, next time cut half the letter that says, like, oh, you're so amazing, thank you so much for leading this crusade, God has blessed you, blah, blah, blah. And he's like, I just want the facts, and I want to talk about how we're going to do this. It was all business. It was really just like, it spoke to all his best qualities. But he even got sort of theatric about it. Like he pretended to interrogate someone and then like slip them a key so they could let themselves out. And that was, I think it was one of like his greatest joys.
I wish we learned more about that in history class. I think a really great way to engage kids with this history is spies. I mean, how much cooler does it get?
Adults love spies.
Absolutely. I do have a question about the revolution, and it's more of an opinion question. I think you could ask this question about any founding father, but since we're talking about George tonight, I'll ask specifically about him. And full disclaimer, I have asked another George Washington biography writer this same question. Do you think George Washington could be considered an insurrectionist?
No, because he was a colonist, and he was considered a second-class citizen, and that manifested not in feelings of being disenfranchised, but in actual disenfranchisement. And he was continually told that they had absolutely no voting power. There was, famously taxation without representation, and none of the people who stormed the Capitol can say that. They're represented, they have the right to vote, they benefit from, the government, from federal aid. And yes, very, very different, very different.
I really like the way you tackled that question. I think our last person said yes. So it's great to hear that different opinion. So Osei has written in with an audience question, and she wants to move past the revolution and into presidency. So I think this is the perfect time to do that. And she actually has a question about Martha. Osei writes, Martha was not fully supportive of her husband George Washington's agreeing to become president of the United States. Having said that, what were her reasons to oppose that move? And is it true that Martha did not attend his first inauguration? It has been said that Martha did not arrive in New York until 1 month after the inauguration. Why is that?
Okay, I'll work my way back. She did not arrive until a month later, which was pretty common. A lot of, they didn't even really know how it was going to go. No one had a Bible. At the last minute, someone said there should, it wasn't a part of the plan. It's not actually like written in any law, law that you have to have it. And it's just a choice. And someone said, oh, this would be really good if he had a Bible from a Mason lodge, because he was a Mason. So someone literally ran out and got it just a minute before, and they crowded on the balcony. She was closing up shop. They had young children. They were now raising her grandchildren, because Jackie, their father, had died at Yorktown from camp fever. He'd actually only been there for a few weeks. He wasn't a part of the army. It was really sad for Washington. He raised both of them. He raised Jackie from the time that he was just, 3. And so Washington didn't really want to be president. He wanted to be general. He certainly wanted to be the general. He did a lot of like, oh, I couldn't possibly. But the revolution was long, went on for 8 years. Mount Vernon fell into disrepair. Martha, by the way, hated to travel. She had lost, husbands, 2 children by that time. She was very nervous about everything. And she also felt like, I just want to focus on raising these children. Like, I have lost everything. And she became very, like, she wanted them homeschooled. This was a homebody, but so is Washington. And Washington also felt like he had done his work, but then he was watching everyone ruin it. And so he agreed to be president. He called it, that trip that he took a month before Martha, he called it, he likened it to going to his execution. And he was right. He had everything to lose. And that was his issue with it. Martha's issue with it was that it was a much better deal, as she wrote in a letter, for Washington than for her. He got to have fun. He got to do things. She had to live in New York, which she hated, Philly, which she hated less. The laws were different. In Philly, enslaved people who she considered family could and did run away, because she thought you could give family away as wedding presents. And she didn't like a lot of the people who she was having to host, and she was constantly judged. And it was just a lot of socializing for people who essentially lived on farms, who lived like a much quieter life. If they wanted some excitement, they had control over it. They went to like the Capitol, and they went to like go dance and party, which they did quite a lot when they were a young couple. And so she wrote probably the saddest letter was one that she wrote when Washington was touring, which he did. He did, tours of the North and the South, and he would be gone for months. And even when he was home, he was barely present. But she just said, I think that this is not what I signed up for, and that this is a job for a younger woman. So we think of her as being quite old because, she, by that point, we think of her as, wearing a bonnet with gray hair. She wasn't that old, but she certainly wasn't young and had that sort of energy.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can all kind of relate. After the last year, we've all gotten so used to having our tiny little homesteads and only going out on our own terms. I think anyone could sympathize with her wanting to not have such a vibrant social life.
Definitely.
So you mentioned in that Washington was watching everybody else just blow up what he had worked so hard for, and that's why he felt the need to do this. We have another audience question about, was there anyone else in consideration for this role? The audience member is specifically asking about John Langdon, who is described as first president pro tempore of the Senate, who had the same qualifications and accomplishments as Washington, was also a founding father, was also a signatory of the United States Constitution. So was there a reason that Washington was put up for this job over someone like John Langdon?
He didn't have the same qualifications because no one had given up power but Washington. And that was considered the greatest thing the world had ever seen. This was an era of dictators and monarchs, and they had not seen many military men have such success and then literally beg to give up power so he could go home for Christmas. And he meant it. He really didn't hunger for it. And and it was in fact his greatest fear in his farewell address. He raged against political parties, and he said that the problem with them is that the politicians would just be politicians. They would be serving their country, and they would become undisciplined and greedy and decide, well, we've just got to keep power. Everything is about power. It doesn't really matter how we maintain that power. And he thought that would surely be the downfall of America, and we would deserve it.
So, and to follow up on that, one more audience question. Since the American Revolution ended in 1783 and the first president took office in 1789, why did it take so long? Like, what was the delay of 6 years in there between the end of the revolution and Washington taking office?
There were, the Articles of Confederation, like there were a lot of things that had to be fixed. We had to have a constitution. This all took a while. And there were presidents, there were several. They just weren't getting the job done in the way that Washington would like. And he was very much in contact with people who'd be like, oh, I'm here, I'm just a gentleman farmer, I'm doing my own thing, I want to breed mules. And then he would write to everyone and say, I can't believe it, the horror, like we had everything, and we deserve it, like this is terrible. He's watching the North and the South fight already. And he was greatly disturbed by it. So if he wanted to stay in contact, he didn't. However, when he went to the Constitutional Convention, he really thought that that was it for him. Martha refused to go. He was like, she does not want to leave home at all. This is a year before. He thought he had done his part. You know, he sat, he kept order. He barely said a word, but everyone was looking at him and thinking about the presidency. And whatever they couldn't figure out, they knew that he would, and they can trust him. They could trust him to do so.
So he becomes president, and he enters the presidency quite popular. And you illustrate in the book, you illustrate quite nicely how Washington's contemporaries changed their opinion of him from before he was president to after he was president. Many who supported him prior to his presidency were quite critical of him following the end of his second term. What do you think were some of the major factors that led many to become dissatisfied with Washington in the moment? And do you think he would have come out better liked if he had only served one term?
Yes, last question, definitely. Although things were starting to turn already. I have this like sort of funny chart at the beginning called frenemies, and I compare quotes from the beginning of his presidency, like before he was the president, and then after he became president. And he's estranged from almost every founder and every person in his government, except for Hamilton and, you know, a few others. He's fine with Adams, but he didn't really include Adams very much, and he didn't serve with Adams. He wasn't involved with him. So one of the things that's pretty great is, you know, in the beginning, Thomas Jefferson says, in war, we have produced Washington. You know, he praises him as like our God, and how adored he will be, and, you know, celebrated in the world. And then after Washington became president, Jefferson, who was a cabinet member, and who was writing all these essays behind his back, and of course launched an opposing political party, because the thing is, it's one thing to fight together against a common enemy, the British. It's quite another to try and run a country when, you know, some of you believe in a strong central government like Washington and like Hamilton, and others do not. Also, you have Francophiles and people who are like still pretty into the British. So after he became president, Jefferson said his talents were not above mediocrity, possessing neither copiousness of ideas nor fluency of words. In public, when called on for a sudden opinion, he was unready, short, and embarrassed. That's pretty intense. My favorite is Thomas Paine, though, and then I'll answer the rest of the question, which is that in the beginning he said, I shall never suffer a hint of dishonor, even deficiency of respect to you, to pass unnoticed. And then after he said, as to you, sir, treacherous in private friendship, and a hypocrite in public life, the world will be puzzled to decide whether you're an apostate or an impostor, whether you've abandoned good principles or whether you ever had any. Amazing. Meanest breakup letter from a friend I've ever read. Really burned. So Washington chose neutrality almost always because he thought it was best for the country. We didn't have those boats yet. He had just signed an act to make, to build them. We were just trying to steady our course, and trade was important to us. Certain people, we had signed a treaty with France saying that we would fight with them, but that was before the person we signed it with was guillotined, and Washington felt like he didn't really have to honor that anymore. There was a lot of stuff that there were a lot of opinions about what he should do, but he was actually really consistent. However, he was not great at managing people in a non-military or plantation setting. no one really liked working for him. He wasn't a great employer. And a part of it is he just didn't manage people well. And so Hamilton and Jefferson would just go at it in cabinet meetings. And Jefferson later described it as, he likened it to a cockfight, which means that they were drawing blood and that Washington was just sitting there letting it happen. He wanted them to kill each other. So that sounds unpleasant. A lot of people didn't like that. So it was really just all these things came, and Washington could not take criticism. He was so sensitive.
I can relate.
Yeah.
So given how many of Washington's contemporaries held a negative or less than positive opinion about Washington following the end of his presidency, why do you think Washington has become such a popular president in modern day?
I think, well, we have to remember that was just maybe a lot of outspoken people, but Hamilton still loved him. A lot of people still loved him. Hamilton thought that maybe he had gotten a little bitter towards the end. The farewell address was like heavily edited by Alexander Hamilton because he wanted it to, quote, age well. And Washington is always going to rank highly among presidents because the way that we rank presidents, I vote in the C-SPAN, presidential survey, and it's not, was he a good president? Was he a bad president? It's across a series of metrics. And even within those metrics, we're measuring it, 1 to 5, I think it is. It was this year. And that means that it's complicated. He was a unifier, even if the country became divisive. Partisanship was always bad. It was always really rampant. He managed, however, to establish an office and establish precedents that lasted for hundreds of years. The peaceful transfer of power, 233 years. That's a really good record. Of course, ended in 2021, a historic year.
A different record that ended much earlier was the precedent of only serving 2 terms. What do you think Washington would have thought about FDR's?
He would have thought it was questionable. And FDR did love theatrics and he did love power. I think he probably would have worried, particularly in wartime, that the country would become too dependent on one person. Part of his reluctance to become president, and certainly to serve a second term, was that he felt as if people were identifying him too much with the country rather than the country being the thing and a bunch of other people being around it. He was never supposed to be king. And if he served more than 2 terms, there was this fear that maybe he would die in office, and presidents just keep being quite old. So this is a fear that they all share, really, except for Obama and, well, Kennedy, but that didn't work out that well. And so I think that was a big part of it. He feared if he died, people would just assume like his grandson should be president or his vice president or something. It really needed to be. Washington loved a clean break. Like when he broke up with the country, he didn't try to get back with it. It just kept trying to get back with him.
I almost wonder if he had died in office, if the precedent would have been president until you die in office.
Possibly. I mean, yes, possibly, which would be really interesting quite quickly. Quite quickly. I don't even want to, I can't.
So let's switch gears a little bit, and I do want to talk more about Washington's slaves. So in the book, you called Mount Vernon a forced labor camp and wrote extensively about the slaves that attempted or did escape over the years, including the slaves who escaped onto the Savage during the Revolution, and prominent slaves like Hercules and Oni Judge, who escaped during Washington's presidency. What was life like on Mount Vernon for the enslaved population?
Well, they vastly outnumbered white people. There is, and no Black person works at the library at Mount Vernon right now. No one, they're the only Black people on staff are reenactors. And what, there are quite a few letters that suggest that Washington, like any person who owned property, did not want them injured to the point where they could not produce what he needed them to produce. You know, he had 5 farms, he had a full house, he was pretty demanding. And however, he approved corporal punishment and was not above administering it himself. Accounts tell us that unless you were a favored enslaved person of Washington's or of Martha's, life was not great. It seems like clothes were tattered, people were hungry, people tried to supplement food. And when they did that too well, he then made it his property. So they got really good at fishing, and then he wanted to sell the fish at market. Some historians have written that he never sold anyone that he owned, and that's not true. He sold people. He even would, sold them to Barbados, which was a death sentence. He would be worked to death very quickly in a sugar plantation. And the reason, I call it a forced labor camp once in the whole book, and I do so in the same sentence as saying, we call them plantations, and that really evokes this idea of like Gone with the Wind and a beautiful porch. And that's not what was going on for 99.9% of the people there. And so it's really important when we say that, we really use words. We use words because words matter, language matters. And if there's a word for something, we should use it. And so another thing I do in the book is I talk about the titles that he held, general, president, and master. And he was certainly called master more than anything else.
And I do want to call myself out here. I did say slaves instead of enslaved persons, and you're absolutely right that words matter. And thank you to Joyce for gently reminding me in the Q&A box. So I do want to take a moment to highlight another talk we hosted last year for Constitution Week. I had the supreme pleasure of hosting Sheila Arnold, who is one of the first Black research fellows at Mount Vernon, and she hosted
last year. There were literally two, and it's been going on for decades, this fellowship.
Yeah, I mean, they definitely need more representation for sure, but she did talk with us last year. Her talk was titled Seeing Someone Like Me, and it was about the importance of seeing people who look like her in that space. And she often comes in character to different libraries and schools as One Judge, who was Martha Washington's personal maidservant, is the word I often hear used. But if you want to see Sheila Arnold talk about that, or even appear briefly as One Judge, I put the link to that in the chat box. Alexis, who was One Judge?
One Judge, and so her One Judge is, I understand, different. I have not met her. There was a different woman. Before that, they wouldn't allow an One Judge to be played, the ladies of Mount Vernon, because it's not a great story for them. And then Erica Dunbar wrote a book called Never Caught, The Washingtons in Slavery, and made it impossible not to have an One Judge. Ozzie Dungy, who wrote a very popular and performed in a very popular web series called Ask a Slave. You can still look it up. She was a Black interpreter at Mount Vernon, and she wrote a whole series about it. And she had asked to play, and they wouldn't let her. And that's because One Judge was owned by Martha, and she had been in Martha's, service as an enslaved person since she was a child, and Martha considered herself very fond of her and thought that she treated her quite well. As most people who worked in the house were slightly better off than others, but also not, because Martha's grandson and son, also sexually assaulted women who worked in the house. So there was, there were ups and downs, but she felt as though she really loved her. But she also promised to give her away as a wedding present to their most volatile stepchild. And that was frightening. It was also frightening to her because her entire family was still at Mount Vernon, everyone she loved and knew in the world. There was reason to believe that Eliza's husband might target her almost immediately. He had children with enslaved people before. And she also was allowed to walk out that front door because they were living in Philadelphia at the time. And the law in Philadelphia had said that if you had been there for 6 months as an enslaved person, you would be set free. And what they often did was there were letters. The Washingtons were very open about it, in which they talk about, we can't let them know this law. And if they find out, we either have to send them home immediately or just rotate them all the time, keep an eye on them, but like really no one should be there who knows this. And so what they would do is they'd go home, 5 months and 25 days, and they would go home to Mount Vernon, and then they'd come back a week later and the clock would reset. So while president, he knowingly broke the law. Ona Judge walks out the front door when they're about to go home. It's her last chance when they're packing up. And she makes it all the way to New Hampshire. And they pursue her until basically, Washington dies.
Why do you think he was so against freeing the people he enslaved? And why was he so against specifically her escaping? I mean, he put in so much effort to try to get her back.
Most of Washington's letters, even if they're about William Lee, his right-hand man during the Revolution, who he allegedly respected, even if he really liked them, he really acted as if like they were very lucky to be given any of his time. And they just needed to be like controlled. He would write about how they were better being owned by him than not being owned by anyone. And so it was a part of like a real fundamental belief in his superiority and the superiority of white people, and which he had known his whole life. He became, an owner of people when he was just a boy. And a part of it is that he really did not like being told what to do by women, especially not Black women. And he was going to have to reimburse the estate for it being the cost of this person who then went on to have children, which Washington considered his property of the estate. And Washington, like many men of Virginia, and certainly founders, was cash poor and land rich. And he was always unwilling to sell land to have cash to pay for things, to the point where the Marquis de Lafayette, who he was really close with, kept saying, emancipate your enslaved people, like think about what it would do for your legacy, think about what it would do for America. It'd be an amazing example. He'd be like, you're so sweet, we'll talk about it later. But he would never do it because he didn't want to spend the money. You had to spend money to emancipate people. And then if they were old or crippled in your service, you had to create like a pension for them.
Something you often hear, and you touch a little bit on this in your book, but let's talk about it now. Was Washington, as so many claim, when it comes to the people he enslaved, was he merely a man of his time?
You then we're discounting that the hundreds of men and people who were on Mount Vernon weren't also men of their time. And the Marquis de Lafayette was a man of his time, a quite famous one. He was the hero of 2 revolutions. He was proposing that Washington do this all the time. Ben Franklin started out as an owner of people, went to a school and realized that if you just gave Black people the same education and the same sort of opportunities, that you really couldn't tell the difference. And by the end of his life, he's proposing abolition. Washington is signing, fugitive slave acts. So I think there were plenty of men of their time. In Virginia, one of his neighbors emancipated the people who had worked on his property, and he was like chased out with fire running after him. So it was not without risk, but and who knows what would have happened? Who knows if it would have made a difference? Maybe not. But maybe it would have, because everyone would have been like, oh my God, Washington didn't know, I have to do it. Maybe Jefferson would have done that. Who knows? We can't say, but we can say what what didn't happen. And to say that he had some sort of evolution or a change of heart is really disingenuous, because he maybe said that in letters to like 2 people who he wanted to like him. And the rest of the time he was still making absolutely no moves to change his way of life and still administering punishment and doing all of these things. So we have to look at what they did rather than what they said once in a while.
And even the slaves he freed in his will, he couldn't free Martha's slaves.
No, and that was a part of it, is it's not only that he didn't want to pay for it, it's that it would have shattered a lot of his the stories that he told himself, that all people who owned people told themselves, which was that it would have been impossible to deny the harm that they had done. And yet Washington would have never banned his, enslaved people from marrying or starting relationships with Marthas, because they produced more equity.
We have a question about this topic from Ashley. Ashley writes, so how many slaves did run away, and how many of them were successful at running away?
Not as many as you would think, considering there are hundreds of people there. During the Revolution, the British, of course, rewarded anyone who rebelled in any way with freedom. That's what they promised them. And they took to the Potomac, where Washington was off fighting, and they started burning great houses that wouldn't give them sustenance of some kind. And enslaved people would run to the boat and they would allow them on, because that was pretty great to like shove it to all the rich rebels. And they got to Washington's house. Lund Washington was the overseer, who was his cousin, and he was not going to see Mount Vernon burn, which Washington had inherited, and of course was his great love. And so he gave them food. And when he went to give them food, he found, dozens of people who were owned by Washington, and he couldn't do anything about it. And he wrote to Washington, and he talked about how, and Washington's response was, I would have had you burn down the entire property rather than give them all of this and allow that to happen. And then at Yorktown, Jackie keeps writing about Martha's son is writing to his mother saying, I'm on the lookout for them. I'm going to find them. I'm going to bring them home. Some were successful. Ona Judge, Hercules, other people, we think, as far as Hercules, but obviously many were not, and people were caught all the time.
Well, thank you for that, and I'm glad it was included. When you look at other biographies of George Washington, do the enslaved residents of Mount Vernon get the same kind of consideration that you're seeing in more modern biographies?
No, it's troubling because it's a chapter. William Lee will be there, who actually Washington, purchased when he was decades into his life. So as a biographer, as a historian, I am looking at people's days, not on their best days and their worst days. Of course that happens, but also just their days. And when I looked at what Washington wrote about and what occupied his mind, it was just as much his business and his enslaved people when there was not a war. And when there was, it was the war and Mount Vernon, repairs, enslaved people. When he was president, it was enslaved people, the country, Mount Vernon. The priorities really didn't change, and that's because it was a major part of his life. So to relegate it to a chapter feels really disingenuous to me, and also like I'm doing a really bad job of if I wanted to write fiction, I would have written fiction.
So speaking of other biographies, Aaron would like to know, are there any other Washington or presidential biographies that you'd recommend? What are some of your favorite that you've read? And I know you've read a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I've written lots of lists about this. You can Google my name and like presidential biographies, and I've written them for Goodreads and like Good Morning America and other places that don't start with G. And they are, I consider presidential biography, because I do not think there is a reliably good one on every president. I consider that a sort of amorphous genre. And so I think, you know, Never Caught, I would consider that, if you asked me for a biography on Washington, I would be like, well, there's a biography in there. Like, they managed to tell the whole story. Woody Horton wrote a great book about Abigail Adams, a great biography about Abigail Adams. There is, let's see, there's a great book about Rosemary Kennedy that I think is wonderful. There's a book called Eunice that came out just a couple years ago that's amazing. I would say, of course, all the Caro books. I mean, are we even, if you haven't gone there, that's the next 15 years of your life. And at the end, I hope he's done with his last one, because it's going to drive the rest of us crazy. I think that Caro certainly sets the standard and is a great inspiration to me. I also, the Fitzgeralds and the Kennedys by Doris Kearns Goodwin, and The Bully Pulpit, many of those things. And then, full disclosure, we produced the Washington series together. I am a great admirer of her. The day my book came out, she called me and said, congratulations. And it was like I didn't even know what to say. I was very awkward about it. I was like, thank you. So I would suggest anything by her. And I would also read people who read a lot. Jamal Bowie, who is a columnist at the Times, is constantly bringing up books in his articles. It's like a recommendation, you know, a day. And he also writes a newsletter. And I have a newsletter called Study, Marry, Kill, and I have links to different book lists that I put together too. So I would suggest, you know, bouncing around, but I've definitely listed them all, and I could just keep going and going. So you should just, start there. And then check back in.
Goodwin was actually my first presidential biography. In high school, it was LBJ, her biography on LBJ. And I just fell in love with her after that. But so we have another audience question. Aaron writes, you have so much experience writing for both scholarly and academic audiences, as well as a general public who may not be familiar with historical biographies. When writing this book, how did you find that artistic balance? And when did you decide who you wanted your audience to be?
I declared my audience early to a lot of fair skepticism, which was that it would be everyone. I wanted people who had read a ton of Washington books to feel like it was slightly different and there was something to learn. And I wanted people who really would never pick up a presidential biography, had no interest in it, the kind of person who would say, why do I have to learn about George Washington? He owned slaves. I don't need to I wanted all those people to read it. And it was really gratifying to me that that they did, and that they not only did, but I would often hear, and this was so nice, that people use the book as a way to talk about things. Because remember, it came out in February of 2020. And if the previous few years hadn't been rough enough, some things happened. I don't know if you remember, they're still happening really, but things were bad and people needed to talk about the presidency, and they needed to talk about a lot of things, and the book enabled them to do so. And that was incredible for me. And the rest of it, you know, the lists and such came from an attempt to achieve those things, which was to think about the information in a slightly different manner, to keep that fresh for myself. And also to make sure that the people who hadn't read a presidential biography before would feel as if they had everything they needed to proceed as experts, because there's a good amount of snobbery in history, and certainly in presidential history, where everything has to be 800 pages and, you know, have some sort of boring portrait on it. And I wanted the truth of, for anyone, it doesn't matter. Everyone is this, you know, I think everyone is as smart as I am. They just don't know what I know. And it's my job to make that as easy as possible for them. It's my literal job. And I do that with such excitement and earnestness that this is just what it looks like. But I do feel like each book that I write has a mood. Alice and Frida Forever, my first book, is has illustrated primary sources because I had just come from working in exhibitions at the New York Public Library. And that's really how I felt they needed their story told. And I'm figuring out that for the next book.
We have another audience question, and that is, are there any other presidents that you found yourself drawn to in the same way that you've been drawn to Washington, or any other unexpected figures you've come across during your research? Doesn't have to be presidents.
Oh, I think they're all so interesting. Everyone thinks it's ridiculous when I say this, but and you can check, I wrote an op-ed about this for the New York Times Magazine, or a feature, and I basically wrote about presidential biographies, and I opened with a biography of Chester A. Arthur. And I would love to read 5 biographies on him, but they don't exist. You know, there's like 2 in total. They're not very good. And I am really interested in all of them. I think there are so many more books that I want to write than I can write. My next book is about young John F. Kennedy. It's called Young Jack, working title. And it's his birth up into right after he writes Profiles in Courage. And a part of the reason I was drawn to this, thoughts about presidential dynasties, and I'd been thinking about a while, 5 or 6 years ago, I was in a Kennedy series on CNN. I've been quietly writing about this for a long time. But it's the same sort of deal. His biographers are ensorcelled. They tell the same old stories that don't seem to have a lot of details. And there's different things to look at. And that would give us a much clearer picture of this man who has been mythologized just as much as Washington. And so I've jumped to a completely different time period, like couldn't be farther away. And it is easier in some ways and much harder in others.
Well, we are nearing the end of our hour together, and I want to say thank you so much. And I can't wait to read Young Jack. I think that's my time period right there. I love digging into that period. So I'm really looking forward to it. And I want to say thank you to our audience for joining us for tonight's Constitution Week event. And thank you to the Friends of Duncan Library for sponsoring this event. My last Constitution Week event is going to be an interview with Phil Hirschkopf. Show of hands, audience, I can't actually see you, but do you know who Phil Hirschkopf is?
Yeah.
So for those of you who do not know, he was one of the 2 lawyers who tried the Loving v. Virginia case. He's a character in the film Loving. His career, that was his first major case. And he had a long career after that, touching on all sorts of things, including representing people who protested the Vietnam War. He represented Norman Mailer. He was PETA's lawyer for a while. He's done so many prison reform things, so many cool things. And we're going to talk to him about his life for an hour on the 30th. So the link to find that program is in the chat box. I'd love to see you all there. Next week, it's Hispanic Heritage Month currently. So we have a professor from JMU coming on Monday to talk about In the Heights and all of the cultural influences that went into that musical. So we've got some great stuff coming up, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. Alexis, do you have any final words for our audience?
I'm so glad that you're here and that you're open to different kinds of ways of talking about the founders. And I think the best thing that everyone can do is really just keep doing that and make sure that you let other people know that it can be quite nice. The water's nice, come on in, sort of thing.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you to the audience. Have a great night.
Thank you.